After 22 years working at Helios Defense Systems, the career I had spent half my life building was quietly taken from me and placed into the hands of a 24-year-old kid who had just graduated from MIT, a kid who had never spent a single night fixing a failing guidance system or carrying the responsibility of lives, depending on his work. If my story sparks your curiosity, please leave your lucky number in the comments so we can continue this journey together. And let me know where you heard this from. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing, because every subscription helps stories of integrity, resilience, and standing firm reach more people. It happened in a quiet conference room on the 12th floor, where the senior leadership team had gathered for what was officially called a strategic transition meeting. Through the glass walls behind them, the massive Helios manufacturing complex stretched across the Horizon factories, producing the very defense systems my team had spent 2 decades designing. The room carried the heavy stillness of a decision that had already been made. Across the table sat CEO Richard Halverson, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone convinced he was about to lead the company into a brilliant new era. Beside him sat his nephew, Dylan Halverson, 24 years old, freshly graduated from MIT, already sitting in the position that had been mine for more than 2 decades. He scrolled through his tablet while the meeting unfolded, occasionally glancing up with the casual confidence of someone who had never been responsible for a system failure that could cost a pilot his life. My name is Thalia Ward. I'm 46 years old, and until that morning, I served as the lead systems architect responsible for Helios Defense's navigation and targeting infrastructure. For more than 2 decades, my team and I designed the systems that guided aircraft safely through hostile airspace and stabilized missile platforms when electronics failed. Just a month earlier, the board had called those systems mission-critical. Now they were suddenly being described as outdated engineering. Richard finally slid a thin folder across the table toward me. "Your time here is finished. Thalia," he said calmly. 22 years is impressive, but Helios needs real innovation. Dylan understands next-generation engineering in ways your generation simply doesn't. Inside the folder were termination papers. What Richard didn't realize was that by firing me that morning, he had just triggered something buried deep inside the company's patent agreements. The next part of this story blends a few fictional elements with the help of creative tools and artificial intelligence, all crafted to share a meaningful lesson and stir the emotions behind the experience. Thank you for spending your time listening. And if today isn't the right moment to continue, that's perfectly okay. Take a pause, breathe, and take care of yourself first. Stories can always wait, but your well-being always comes first. What Richard Halverson and his nephew didn't understand about me was simple. My work had never been about titles, promotions, or boardroom recognition. It had always been about responsibility. For more than 2 decades at Helios Defense Systems, I wasn't just designing aerospace software or engineering control systems. I was building the invisible safety layers that kept pilots alive when technology failed in hostile skies. Guidance systems don't get second chances. When a targeting interface freezes at 30,000 feet, when a navigation array loses satellite lock in contested airspace, the backup systems are the only thing standing between a safe landing and catastrophe. That was the kind of work my team handled. 3 days before that meeting, I had spent nearly 60 hours inside the avionics lab fixing a failure in a carrier-based navigation module. The system had started throwing instability errors during simulated landing procedures. It was the kind of glitch that looked minor in a report, but could kill a pilot during a night landing at sea. While Dylan Halverson had probably been preparing a presentation about AI-driven design optimization, I had been elbow-deep in circuit boards and diagnostic logs, trying to make sure a system would never fail when someone's life depended on it. The people who understood my work were rarely executives. They were pilots, engineers, test crews, people who had actually trusted those systems in the air. But the most important thing Richard didn't understand wasn't the engineering. It was the history behind it. Back in the early years of Helios Defense, the company's founder had always been suspicious of corporate politics and outside interference. He believed that the people who designed critical defense systems should always retain a measure of control over their work. So he insisted on a clause in every patent licensing agreement the company signed, a clause that most executives eventually forgot about. If the original design engineer behind a system was ever terminated without cause, the operational authorization for those patents would automatically revert to that engineer, not the company. And after 22 years, that clause applied to every major system I had built. That clause had been written more than 2 decades earlier, long before Helios Defense Systems became a major contractor. Back then, the company was a small aerospace engineering startup with fewer than 20 employees and a handful of experimental designs we hoped the Pentagon might one day take seriously. The founder, Arthur Keaton, had built his career during an era when corporate espionage in the defense industry was a constant fear. Competitors tried to reverse engineer prototypes. Foreign contractors quietly attempted to copy guidance systems that had taken years to develop. Arthur believed something very strongly. The people who created critical systems should never completely lose control over them. So when we began filing our first patents together, he insisted on adding a clause that most lawyers initially called unnecessary. If the original design engineer was terminated without cause, operational authorization for those patents would revert to that engineer, not the corporation. At the time, the clause felt almost symbolic. Helios was a small company then. We trusted each other, and none of us imagined a situation where it would ever matter. But Arthur insisted. Trust, he used to say, is built over decades and destroyed in a single decision. When that decision comes, the work needs protection. Over the years, Helios grew into something much bigger. Our systems began appearing in aircraft navigation platforms, naval targeting systems, and defense coordination networks used by allied forces around the world. Every new design added another patent, another licensing agreement, another legal document carrying that same clause Arthur Keaton had demanded years earlier. By the time Helios Defense became a billion-dollar contractor, the patent portfolio tied to my engineering work had grown to include 43 defense technologies, missile guidance frameworks, carrier landing navigation protocols, redundant targeting architectures. Together, they were valued at roughly $895 million. And buried in the authorization layer of every one of those patents was a simple requirement: operational approval from the original engineer of record, which, after Richard Halverson slid that termination folder across the table, meant Helios Defense had just removed the only person legally allowed to authorize them. For a few seconds after Richard finished speaking, the room stayed completely silent. No one asked questions. No one objected. The executives around the table simply watched, the way people do when a decision has already been made, and everyone knows the meeting is only a formality. The thin folder sat in front of me. Inside were 3 pages that quietly summarized 22 years of my life: termination notice, transition instructions, a polite paragraph thanking me for my years of service. I looked at the pen resting beside the papers. Moments like that rarely explode the way people imagine. There was no shouting, no argument, just a quiet understanding that the decision had already been sealed. So I picked up the pen and signed. Richard Halverson leaned back in his chair, satisfied, like a man who believed he had just cleared the last obstacle standing in the way of progress. Across the table, Dylan was already typing on his tablet. I caught a glimpse of the screen as I stood up, excited to step into a leadership role at Helios Defense Systems. 22 years of engineering replaced by a social media announcement. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. No speeches, no protest. There was nothing left to say. I walked back to my office for the last time. The building looked exactly as it always had: engineers discussing test data, technicians moving equipment through the halls, the quiet hum of machines running systems my team had built. Most of them had no idea what had just happened upstairs. On my desk sat a few notebooks, some technical manuals, and a framed photo of my son during his first flight training lesson. I packed them slowly into a cardboard box, 22 years of work can't really fit into a box, but the things that remind you of it somehow do. When I reached the lobby, Carlos Mendoza, the security guard who had been there almost as long as I had, looked up, leaving early today. Ms. Ward. I handed him my access badge. Something like that. Carlos glanced at the badge, then back at me. Helios won't be the same without you. I gave him a small smile. What neither of us realized yet was that the real consequences of Richard Halverson's decision were only just beginning. The next morning was the first time in more than 2 decades that I woke up without a reason to rush. For 22 years, my mornings had followed the same routine, checking overnight system diagnostics, reviewing engineering reports, scanning alerts from testing facilities before the first meeting of the day. That morning, there were no alerts, no engineers calling about unstable telemetry data, no production teams waiting for design approvals, just the quiet hum of the coffee machine in my kitchen. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee and watched the city slowly wake up. It felt strange. For most of my career, Helios Defense had been the center of everything: late nights in avionics labs, emergency calls when testing systems failed, weekends spent rewriting code so aircraft guidance systems would never fail when pilots needed them most. I had missed birthdays, holidays, even my son's first solo flight ceremony, because somewhere, something in a defense system needed to be fixed, and now, suddenly, none of it belonged to me anymore. I was halfway through my coffee when my phone buzzed. The number on the screen belonged to North Star Aerospace, one of Helios Defense's largest international partners. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Thalia," the voice on the other end said, tense and confused. "We're getting system authorization errors on the carrier navigation platform. Our engineers say the license verification failed." I didn't say anything at first, because I already knew what had happened. Those systems weren't just pieces of software. Every one of them was tied to a licensing protocol built directly into the patents that governed their operation, and those patents required something very specific: authorization from the original design engineer. The engineer Helios Defense had fired less than 24 hours earlier, which meant that, at that exact moment, the systems keeping several of Helios's defense contracts operational had just stopped recognizing the company that owned them. After I ended the call with North Star Aerospace, I sat quietly at the kitchen table for a long moment. I hadn't triggered anything. There was no revenge plan, no secret command waiting to be executed. The systems were simply doing what they had always been designed to do. Every Monday morning at 8:30, the licensing framework inside our defense platforms performed an automatic verification check. It was a security layer I had built years earlier after a competitor attempted to reverse engineer one of our missile guidance modules. The system verified 3 things: patent ownership, operational licensing, authorization from the original design engineer. If any of those checks failed, the software didn't shut down completely, but critical functions would refuse to activate until the authorization layer was restored. At the time, the safeguard was meant to prevent intellectual property theft. I had never imagined it might someday be triggered by my own company. My phone buzzed again. Another call. This time it was Ardent Maritime Systems, a contractor responsible for naval guidance integration across several allied fleets. "Thalia, we're getting the same authorization failure," the engineer on the line said. "Our diagnostics say the system can't validate the engineering license." I leaned back in my chair. 2 calls within 10 minutes. That meant the automated verification cycle had started, which also meant the problem wasn't isolated. The same authorization protocol was embedded across dozens of systems Helios Defense had delivered over the years: aircraft navigation platforms, missile guidance frameworks, naval targeting interfaces. All of them depended on the same patent licensing structure, and all of them were now asking the same question: where was the original design engineer by mid-morning? My phone had received 6 more calls. Different companies, different systems. The same error message? Helios Defense had fired me the previous afternoon. What Richard Halverson didn't realize was that the systems his company depended on were now discovering that decision, one contract at a time, by late morning. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. The calls kept coming. A contractor responsible for missile stabilization systems in Europe, a naval integration team working with carrier landing guidance software, an aerospace manufacturer that supplied avionics components to 3 different defense programs. Different companies, different continents, the same problem. Every system that relied on Helios Defense's patent authorization framework was suddenly failing its verification checks. Most of the engineers calling me sounded confused. Some sounded worried. But none of them yet understood the real reason. Around noon, I opened my laptop and checked the defense industry forums, where engineers and contractors usually shared technical alerts. The first posts had already appeared. Authorization errors across Helios navigation systems. Anyone else seeing this carrier guidance module refusing license verification after last update. Multiple contracts reporting patent validation failures. The threads were growing quickly. Engineers from different companies were comparing logs and diagnostic reports, trying to identify what looked like a widespread software malfunction. But it wasn't a malfunction. It was a legal condition. The patent authorization layer inside those systems required validation from the original design engineer listed in the licensing agreement. And that engineer had officially been terminated the previous afternoon. By early afternoon, the situation was escalating. Defense contractors weren't just discussing the issue internally anymore. They were calling Helios Defense directly, demanding explanations. Because when guidance systems fail authorization checks, it doesn't just delay a project, it can suspend entire defense contracts. And contracts in this industry aren't measured in thousands. They're measured in hundreds of millions, somewhere inside Helios headquarters. Richard Halverson was probably beginning to hear the first reports. Engineers asking why multiple defense partners were suddenly reporting authorization failures. Managers trying to understand why licensing systems that had worked for years were suddenly rejecting their own company. What Richard still didn't realize was that this wasn't a technical glitch. It was the natural consequence of a decision he had made less than 24 hours earlier, and the industry was only just starting to notice. The first call from Helios Defense came a little after 2 in the afternoon. I had just finished another conversation with an avionics engineer from a European contractor when my phone buzzed again. The name on the screen made me pause. Mason Caldwell, Helios's vice president of engineering for years. Mason had been the person responsible for coordinating technical teams across our defense programs. He was also one of the few executives in the company who actually understood how the systems worked. I answered. "Thalia," Mason said immediately, his voice tight. "We've got a problem." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I waited. Multiple defense partners are reporting authorization failures across our navigation and targeting platforms. He continued. Our engineers say the patent licensing layer is rejecting verification requests. I leaned back in my chair. That sounds like a licensing issue. It's more than that, Mason said quickly. The system logs show the authorization field tied to the original design engineer is inactive. He paused. And your name is attached to that field? Of course it was. That authorization layer had been designed to prevent external theft of proprietary defense technology, without verification from the engineer listed in the patent documentation. Critical functions inside the systems would refuse to initialize. The safeguard had worked flawlessly for years, until the company removed the engineer responsible for it. Richard terminated my employment yesterday, I said calmly. Mason went quiet, for several seconds. The line was completely silent. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, less technical, more uneasy. Thalia, do you realize what this means I already did? If the authorization layer remained inactive, every defense contractor using Helios systems would eventually fail its licensing verification cycle. Aircraft navigation platforms, naval targeting interfaces, missile guidance frameworks, all of them depended on the same patent authorization structure, and that structure required approval from the original engineer of record. The engineer Helios Defense had fired, which meant the company had just created a problem that wasn't limited to one system. It was embedded across their entire defense portfolio, and Mason Caldwell had just begun to understand it. Mason ended the call without asking me to fix anything. I suspected he already knew the truth. This wasn't something the engineering department could quietly patch overnight. The authorization structure was embedded inside the patent licensing framework itself, which meant the problem wasn't technical, it was contractual. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, the name on the screen made me pause longer. Richard Halverson, the CEO who had calmly ended my career the previous afternoon. I let the phone ring for a moment before answering. "Thalia," he said immediately. His voice sounded tighter than it had in the conference room. "We need to talk. Do we—" "There's a system issue affecting several of our defense partners," Richard continued. "Our engineers believe it's connected to the patent authorization framework you designed." I took a sip of coffee before replying. "That framework has been working correctly for years." "Yes. Well, something seems to have changed," he said. "Multiple contractors are reporting verification failures." I didn't respond. Richard exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "Our engineering team says the authorization layer requires validation from the original design engineer." "That's correct." Another pause. "And that engineer is you?" "Yes." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. When Richard spoke again, his voice had lost the confidence he carried in the boardroom. "So how do we restore the authorization?" The question hung in the air between us. It was the first time since yesterday's meeting that Richard sounded less like a CEO delivering a decision and more like someone realizing the consequences of it. Because the solution was actually very simple. The systems would resume normal operation as soon as the original design engineer approved the authorization request. But there was one detail Richard Halverson had clearly overlooked when he slid that termination folder across the table. The engineer required to approve those systems no longer worked for Helios Defense Systems for several seconds after I said that. Richard didn't speak. I could almost hear the moment the realization reached him. The authorization system wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. "You're telling me," Richard finally said slowly, "that none of those systems can be verified without you. That's correct." Another long silence followed. Somewhere in the background, I could hear muffled voices, people talking urgently, phones ringing, the distant chaos of a company that had just discovered a problem it didn't understand how to solve. "Thalia," Richard said again, his tone very different now. "We may have moved too quickly yesterday." It was the first crack in the certainty he had shown in that conference room, because the truth was becoming clear. By firing the engineer responsible for the systems that powered Helios Defense's most valuable contracts, Richard Halverson hadn't just replaced an employee, he had accidentally shut down the foundation of his entire company. Stories like this remind me that the real value of our work isn't always visible in a boardroom decision. Sometimes it's hidden in years of quiet responsibility, trust, and the people who depend on what we build. If you found yourself in my place, what would you do? Would you walk away? Or stand firm in the value of your work? I'd also love to know, where are you listening from today? Your voice matters here. And if this story made you think or feel something, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing the video. One simple action from you might help this message reach someone who needs it. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.